Imagine the chill of the embalming chamber, a place where silence weighs heavier than stone, and the flicker of oil lamps throws shadows that seem to whisper secrets. You are a royal embalmer in ancient Egypt, a man sworn to uphold sacred ritual and preserve the sanctity of the dead. Every cut you make is guided by tradition, every binding of linen a prayer to the gods. But this night is different. Before you lies the pharaoh's wife, her body pale upon the polished marble slab. Yet the command you have been given is no ordinary instruction. It is an order that strikes at the heart of your beliefs, an instruction that will force you to violate every sacred code you were raised to honor. You have been told to preserve her not for eternity in the way of all queens before her, but in a manner that defies tradition, a way that seems almost designed to strip her of dignity. The reason whispered to you chills your blood more than the cold chamber air. It is said that this act is not for her, not even for the pharaoh, but for the gods themselves. This is no fiction. It was reality for embalmers and priests who lived within the rigid, yet paradoxical world of ancient Egypt. A world where divine law was absolute, yet the laws of man could bend it into cruelty. Behind the golden masks, the treasures, and the magnificent pyramids lies a civilization whose practices would stun modern sensibilities. These people, whose genius gave us monumental architecture and mathematics, also lived by codes of intimacy and ritual so extreme that later generations of historians sought to erase them from record. The sanitized history you learned in school, the glittering tombs, the noble pharaohs, the gentle Nile, hide something darker, something so disturbing that entire museums conspired to conceal it for over a century. From 3100 BCE until the fall of Cleopatra's dynasty in 30 BCE, Egypt thrived along the fertile banks of the Nile. But fertility was not just agricultural, it was cosmic, divine, and political. Intimacy was not a private act, it was a public duty, a spiritual offering, a ritual weapon. The pharaoh's potency was thought to determine whether the Nile would rise and flood the fields, whether the harvest would feed the people, and whether the gods would bless or curse the kingdom. Imagine the pressure. The god-king of Egypt, revered as divine, expected to prove his sacred vitality before gods and men alike. Failure was not simply personal weakness. It was a threat to civilization itself. That pressure twisted devotion into something darker. Temples were inscribed with scenes and formulas not shown on tourist guides. Papyrus scrolls spoke of ceremonies too explicit for polite audiences. And when archaeologists of the Victorian age stumbled upon such evidence, they recoiled. They did not merely avert their eyes. They buried, burned, and locked away the truth. Entire chapters of history were smothered under layers of plaster and censorship because their content was deemed unfit for the public. The official reports omitted them, and the artifacts that survived were hidden in private collections or restricted museum vaults. But the Egyptians themselves had no such shame. They believed sexual energy was cosmic energy. Every act of intimacy, however small or grand, echoed through the heavens. An orgasm was not mere pleasure, it was a conversation with the gods. A position was not just physical, it was prayer. In their worldview, the boundaries between worship and the body, between the divine and the carnal, dissolved entirely. A kiss could be an offering. A ritual act of penetration could be a key to cosmic balance. And in this blurring of body and faith, the line between sacred and abusive was often erased. The embalmer standing over the queen's body understood all this. He knew that he was not simply preparing her for eternity, but participating in a drama that touched the Nile itself. The gods demanded proof. The pharaoh demanded control. And the body of a woman, once queen, now lifeless, became the battlefield upon which divine order would be reinforced. He sharpened his blade, the metal glinting in lamplight, and realized with a shudder that tonight he would carve not merely flesh, but history. Most people, when they think of ancient Egypt, picture dazzling sunlight glinting off the golden mask of Tutankhamun, the solemn gaze of colossal statues, or the mathematical precision of the pyramids rising against the desert sky. They imagine civilization at its most radiant, pharaohs ruling as gods, artisans crafting wonders, priests chanting hymns to Ra as the sun rose faithfully each dawn. But beneath this glittering surface lay shadows too disturbing to fit into the neat stories told in schoolbooks. Egypt's greatness was built not only on mathematics, astronomy, and irrigation, but also on practices that blurred the boundaries between faith and flesh, between worship and exploitation. The Egyptians did not treat sexuality as private or hidden. It was cosmic. To them, the universe itself pulsed with a life force that could be stirred and directed by human intimacy. Sexual energy was not indulgence but raw power. To the Egyptian mind, this force shaped the cycles of the Nile, the fertility of fields, the strength of armies, and the very balance of man, the cosmic order that sustained their world. This belief system elevated sexual ritual into the highest form of religious devotion. Yet, by tying the fate of civilization to intimate acts, it created a structure where human bodies, especially the bodies of the powerless, became tools for divine maintenance. Victorian archaeologists, when they uncovered this truth, recoiled. The 19th century was an era defined by rigid moral codes, where even table legs were draped with cloth to avoid indecency. To stumble upon wall paintings in Egyptian tombs depicting acts that scandalized the most liberal of modern minds was unthinkable. Many of these scholars destroyed evidence outright, burning papyri that described rituals, chiseling away frescoes, or hiding entire collections in private vaults accessible only to a select few. Their actions were not merely prudish. They reshaped our understanding of Egypt. What we were left with was a clean version of history, stripped of its most troubling complexities. But the Egyptians themselves would never have understood such shame. In their worldview, the pharaoh was not simply king, but a living conduit between humanity and the gods. His sexual performance was considered a matter of cosmic survival. If the pharaoh could not fulfill his role, ritually, physically, the Nile might fail to flood, crops would wither, and famine would stalk the land. This divine expectation gave birth to a culture where public displays of sexual vitality were not scandalous but sacred. Imagine a society where a ruler's intimate life was more important than his military campaigns, where his body was scrutinized not only by physicians, but by priests searching for signs of divine potency. This cosmic burden did not fall on the pharaoh alone. Nobles, priests, and even temple servants were drawn into the system. Their duty was not merely to pray or administer rituals, but to embody them, sometimes with their own flesh. And at the bottom of this hierarchy were those with no power at all: slaves, servants, and tragically, children born into elite families who were often dedicated to temples before they were old enough to understand what it meant. For them, sexuality was not a choice but a destiny imposed by religious authority. To outsiders, such as the Greeks and later the Romans, these practices seemed barbaric, incompatible with notions of dignity and morality. To the Egyptians, however, they were necessary, for without them, the gods might abandon their people. The paradox of Egyptian civilization lies here. The same society that built timeless monuments to order and harmony also tolerated rituals of chaos, exploitation, and abuse, all justified as essential to cosmic balance. It is this hidden darkness, buried under centuries of silence and censorship, that reveals Egypt not as a simple land of wonder, but as a complex civilization where light and shadow, beauty and horror were inseparably bound. To understand Egypt's most unsettling practices, we must first step into their worldview, a cosmos where every breath, every harvest, every drop of the Nile was charged with divine meaning. For the Egyptians, intimacy was never just intimacy. It was creation itself reenacted, a miniature echo of the gods shaping the world from chaos. In their myths, the first mound of earth rose from the primeval waters when Atum, the self-created god, brought forth life through an act both solitary and profoundly sexual. From that moment, fertility and cosmic order were inseparable, and human sexuality became a mirror of divine power. The pharaoh embodied this principle most of all. He was not merely a ruler but the physical vessel of Mad, the balance that sustained the universe. His virility was more than a private matter. It was a state ritual. When the Nile failed to flood, when famine loomed, whispers spread that the king's potency had waned. The burden was unimaginable. The body of one man symbolically carried the survival of millions. In some temples, reliefs depicted the king performing ritual acts of fertility, sometimes alone, sometimes with priestesses representing goddesses. These were not shameful depictions but sacred testaments to his divine role. Every orgasm in this worldview was a dialogue with eternity. Priests taught that climax was not a fleeting pleasure, but a spark of divine essence, a fragment of creation itself. Positions and gestures were codified like prayers. Just as a priest intoned words before the altar, bodies moved in prescribed forms believed to channel cosmic energy. It was an invisible economy of sacred force, with human intimacy as its currency. Tourists today wandering through temples at Luxor or Karnak see rows of hieroglyphs and towering columns. But hidden within inscriptions, sometimes erased, sometimes overlooked, lie fragments of text that speak of this fusion of worship and sexuality. The famous Turin erotic papyrus, one of the few surviving explicit scrolls, shocked modern scholars with its frankness. To the Egyptians, however, it was not obscene but illustrative, a guidebook to divine play where laughter, pleasure, and fertility were all aspects of sacred order. Yet such devotion to cosmic sexuality had consequences. It erased the line between the personal and the political, between worship and exploitation. When the pharaoh's potency was tied to the prosperity of the Nile, failure could not be tolerated. Rituals became more desperate, more extreme, as priests and rulers sought to force the god's hand. If floods failed, if crops shriveled, then the ceremonies became darker, pushing human bodies into roles of sacrifice disguised as service. Still, to the Egyptian mind, this was not degradation but duty. A farmer might see his labor as feeding the nation. A priestess or temple youth might be told that their body was feeding the gods. To resist was to invite cosmic collapse. Thus intimacy, stripped of its humanity, became ritualized obligation. And as generations passed, this sacred framework turned into a system where power used belief to bind flesh as tightly as any linen wrapped around a mummy. It was a worldview at once beautiful and terrifying, where every kiss was a prayer, every touch a cosmic act, and every body a temple of the gods. Yet the darker side of this belief was already waiting in the shadows, ready to consume those born into its grip. But what happens when a belief system elevates sexual energy to divine necessity? What happens when intimacy is no longer private choice but sacred duty, where refusal might mean the wrath of gods or the collapse of society itself? The answer lies in the darkest corners of Egyptian ritual. For the elite, children were often not born to live their own lives, but to serve cosmic order. Inscriptions and fragments of papyri suggest that noble families would dedicate their sons and daughters to temple service before they had even reached maturity. These children, some barely able to speak, were told their bodies did not belong to themselves but to the gods. The Nile's flood, the fertility of fields, and the survival of Egypt were said to depend on their obedience. The cosmic burden was placed upon shoulders far too small to bear it. Domestic slaves fared no better. To own a servant was to own not just their labor but their flesh. Abuse was not considered shameful or illegal. It could be justified as an offering to the gods, or as a symbolic act to restore balance when the Nile betrayed its people. When the annual flood failed, priests and rulers alike looked for scapegoats, for ways to stimulate divine favor. The solution was often more ritualized intimacy, more sacrifice of innocence. The logic was cruel. If the gods had turned away, only more extreme devotion might lure them back. Imagine the spiral of desperation. A harvest withers, families starve, whispers spread through the temples that perhaps the king has failed in his duty. To restore confidence, ceremonies grow darker, more brutal. Young bodies are forced into acts they cannot understand. Slaves are paraded into chambers where their humiliation is framed as cosmic necessity. The boundary between faith and violence collapses. What began as worship turns into exploitation sanctioned by religion. Ancient texts describe rituals that, to modern eyes, read like systematic abuse. But to the priests who recorded them, these were prescriptions for survival. A child's pain could be written off as divine service. A slave's broken body might be described as an acceptable sacrifice to ensure the Nile's return. The Egyptians believed they were maintaining Mad, the sacred balance of the universe. In truth, they were feeding a system where belief became a mask for cruelty. And yet, this was not hidden shame to them. These rituals were woven into the fabric of festivals, inscribed into temple walls and preserved in papyri. They were not secret perversions, but public doctrine. What disturbs us most is that it was all considered normal, necessary, even holy. In this way, cosmic sexuality revealed its darkest face. A society where human bodies became instruments, where innocence was consumed by ritual, and where the desperation to control the gods led to acts that scarred generations. The Nile gave life, but when it failed, it demanded payment in flesh. The turning point in uncovering Egypt's hidden darkness came not in some grand temple or forgotten tomb, but in the sterile quiet of a laboratory in 1925. Howard Carter's team, fresh from the breathtaking discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, had finally begun the meticulous work of examining the boy king's remains. They expected to find the fragile body of a child ruler preserved in the traditional manner, organs carefully removed, limbs bound in linen, amulets tucked between wrappings to guide him in the afterlife. But when the linen was unwrapped and the body laid bare, the embalmer's craft revealed something that would haunt Egyptology for decades. Tutankhamun's genitals were missing. Not lost to decay, not damaged by tomb robbers, but surgically removed. The cut was precise, the mark of a skilled hand. Analysis showed it was performed shortly after death as part of the embalming process itself. To Carter's astonishment, the mutilation was deliberate. The question was, why? The boy king was already a figure of fascination, his short reign marked by turmoil, his death shrouded in mystery. But this discovery added a darker dimension. Egyptian embalmers did not simply preserve the body, they reshaped it for eternity. To remove a pharaoh's manhood was no accident. It was a ritual decision, one loaded with cosmic meaning. Did priests believe Tutankhamun unworthy of virility in the afterlife? Or was the act meant to transform him into something more than human, an offering to the gods in a form no mortal could claim? This was not an isolated case. As more royal mummies were studied with advancing techniques, X-rays, CT scans, chemical analysis, a pattern emerged. Tutankhamun was not the only one. Other pharaohs and nobles bore evidence of similar modifications. Some had been castrated, others embalmed with artificial enhancements inserted into their bodies. In one particularly chilling case, foreign substances were discovered packed into the pelvic cavity, as though the embalmers sought to reconstruct a body part that nature or death had taken away. To modern eyes, these findings suggested desecration. But to the Egyptians, this was likely ritual perfection. In their belief system, the body had to be altered, adjusted, even mutilated to prepare it for its role in the afterlife. Tutankhamun's missing organs may have been part of a cosmic script we only barely understand. A transformation from flawed humanity into eternal servant of the gods. For the archaeologists of the 1920s, however, the implications were too scandalous. Carter himself recorded the discovery but cloaked it in vague language. His team quietly avoided emphasizing it in public reports. The world, already captivated by King Tut's curse and tales of golden treasure, was not told the full truth. The most disturbing detail, the absence of the boy king's manhood, was carefully veiled in silence. Yet the body spoke louder than any inscription. The cut was there, the absence undeniable. Tutankhamun had been reshaped, not by fate or decay, but by the deliberate hands of priests. And his mutilation was only the beginning of a pattern that would shake every assumption about Egyptian burial, power, and the role of sexuality in the kingdom of the dead. Tutankhamun's mutilation might have been dismissed as an anomaly, a single bizarre ritual act, were it not for what followed. As scholars began applying new technologies, first X-rays, then CT scans, and later chemical and microscopic analysis, the veil lifted on Egypt's royal dead. What they found was not an isolated mystery, but a chilling pattern. Mummies from across dynasties revealed the same disturbing evidence. deliberate genital modification. Some had been castrated entirely, the cuts as clean and purposeful as Tutankhamun's. Others showed traces of substances packed into their bodies, resins, sand, even artificial inserts, designed to enhance or replace what nature had given. The evidence was undeniable. Embalmers were not just preserving bodies, they were altering them, reshaping flesh for purposes that went beyond preservation. One discovery sent shivers through the academic world. In the tomb of an unnamed prince from the 18th dynasty, examination revealed that mutilation had been carried out not after death, but before it. The bone structure bore signs of trauma inflicted during life. Tissue remnants showed evidence of clotting, the telltale marker that the boy had been alive when his genitals were removed. This was not a botched punishment or an accident. It was systematic, deliberate, ritualized surgery performed on a living child of royal blood. What could justify such horror? Ancient Egyptian texts, once puzzling, began to reveal their true meaning. Inscriptions spoke of making the dead more perfect, of preparing the body so that it might serve the gods eternally. Priests wrote of purifying the vessel, stripping away mortal flaws to craft a form suitable for eternity. The mutilation was not seen as desecration. It was considered elevation, transformation into a more sacred state. And yet, beneath this religious logic lies something darker. The control of sexuality in Egypt was not limited to ritual. It was political. By mutilating or modifying the bodies of princes and pharaohs, priests could claim authority over their afterlives, binding even kings to a doctrine that placed temple power above royal flesh. It was a silent domination, written not in decrees but carved into the bodies of rulers themselves. Modern parallels only deepen the unease. We know from other cultures, Assyria, Persia, even imperial China, that eunuchs were often trusted servants, their mutilation ensuring loyalty and removing threats of dynastic ambition. But Egypt's case was different. Here, the act was not merely political but cosmic, framed as a sacred necessity. In mutilation, power and worship fused, and the human body became both the battlefield and the trophy of divine control. For the Victorians who uncovered this evidence, it was intolerable. They could not reconcile golden thrones and hieroglyphs with the brutal reality of mutilated kings. Many chose to look away, to bury the findings in archives or gloss over them in scholarly reports. But the scans and remains have outlived denial. The truth, once suppressed, now emerges with every examination. Egypt's greatest rulers were not only embalmed as gods but mutilated as offerings, their sexuality carved away to serve a higher, more terrible order. The implications reverberate even today. Were these modifications merely ceremonial, or did they reflect practices imposed upon the living? Did royal children endure such transformations to prove their worth to the gods? The more we uncover, the more unsettling the answers become. Tutankhamun was not alone. He was part of a system where cosmic faith and human cruelty were bound together in linen, resin, and silence. When the 19th century archaeologists first lowered their lamps into the tombs of Egypt, they expected sanctity, solemn hymns carved in stone, and the majesty of kings. What they did not expect were frescoes filled with explicit scenes, papyri describing rituals that blurred the line between devotion and debauchery, and mummies altered in ways that no European imagination could reconcile with civilized antiquity. Their reaction was not to record faithfully, but to conceal. And so began one of the greatest acts of historical suppression in modern scholarship. Take Giovanni Belzoni in 1817, a giant of a man often called the strongman archaeologist. When he stumbled into a tomb covered in sexual imagery, his choice was swift. He plastered over entire walls to prevent others from seeing what he had found. His published account spoke only of decorative scenes and beautiful symbols, never acknowledging the erotic reality hidden beneath the new white layer. The evidence remained, sealed away like a second burial, a victim of prudish morality. This pattern repeated across decades. Auguste Mariette, the founder of Egypt's Antiquities Service, quietly collected explicit figurines and papyri, but instead of placing them in museums, he stored them in private chambers, accessible only to trusted male scholars. Later, Flinders Petrie, one of the most respected archaeologists of his generation, admitted in his journals to destroying artifacts he deemed too obscene, statues smashed, papyri burned, their contents lost forever. He was not alone. Across Europe, similar choices were made. Museums institutionalized this silence. The British Museum created so-called special access collections, often euphemistically labeled miscellaneous objects, where thousands of Egyptian artifacts depicting sexual acts were locked away. In Cairo, when the Egyptian Museum opened, entire categories of artifacts were quietly shuffled into storage rooms that the public never saw. Visitors admired sarcophagi and golden masks, while in the shadows, the more troubling truths lay boxed and forgotten. Even translations of papyri were cleansed. The famous Ebers Papyrus, one of Egypt's most important medical texts, contained more than 40 passages on sexual health and ritual practice. Yet in Victorian translations, these sections vanished, phrases softened into euphemism or excised altogether. Readers in Europe believed they were seeing Egypt's wisdom in full, but in reality, entire dimensions of its worldview were missing. The censorship shaped how the world came to see ancient Egypt. We inherited an image of a noble civilization of mathematics, astronomy, and art, but not of one where intimacy and power intertwined in ways both sacred and cruel. Egypt became sanitized, a land of golden treasures but no shadows. The darker truths were erased not by the ancients, but by modern men who could not bear to face them. This suppression has consequences that still echo. By silencing the most disturbing aspects of Egypt's culture, Victorian archaeologists created gaps in our understanding, gaps that allowed myths to flourish while truths lay buried. They turned history into a mirror of their own morality, and in doing so, they blinded us to the complexities of a civilization that was at once magnificent and monstrous. The embalmers had hidden their secrets in linen and resin. The Victorians hid them in plaster and archives. Both, in their own way, ensured that the bodies of Egypt and the truths they carried would remain bound in silence. To truly grasp the weight of Egypt's hidden practices, we must look at the structure that sustained them, a hierarchy where intimacy itself became a ladder of power. At the pinnacle stood the pharaoh, not merely a ruler but a living god whose body symbolized the balance of the cosmos. His virility was not personal, it was national. Priests and citizens alike believed that his ability to perform sexually determined whether the Nile would rise, whether crops would grow, whether Egypt would thrive or descend into famine. His private life was no secret. It was a stage on which the survival of millions seemed to rest. Below him, nobles and high priests carried their own burdens. They were expected to demonstrate devotion not only in words or offerings, but in ritualized sexual performance. Ancient inscriptions describe feasts and ceremonies where intimacy was part of religious duty, where nobles proved their worth by embodying fertility before the gods. Failure to participate was seen as weakness, even blasphemy. In this way, the bodies of the elite were bound as tightly by ritual expectation as by the elaborate linens of their tombs. And yet, the weight pressed heaviest on those with no power at all. Slaves, men, women, and children, were the lowest rungs of this cosmic hierarchy. They were not merely laborers but living offerings, bodies to be used in ceremonies or private acts justified as sacred. Legal texts reveal how child slaves were bought and sold specifically for their sexual availability, their value measured by age, appearance, and training. These children were not considered victims but instruments, flesh molded to sustain the machinery of cosmic order. Even within elite families, children were not exempt. Many were given to temples from a young age, dedicated to serve as living vessels of ritual intimacy. For them, sexuality was not choice but obligation, woven into training that began when most modern children would barely be learning to read. This was the paradox of Egyptian devotion. The same civilization that raised colossal temples to honor gods also reduced its most vulnerable to tools of worship. Priests played a central role in justifying this system. They taught that to serve sexually was to serve divinity, that to give one's body was to maintain man, the sacred balance. Families were encouraged to believe that having a child chosen for such service was an honor, even when they knew the true cost. Religion transformed abuse into duty, exploitation into blessing. The hierarchy was complete. At the top, the pharaoh, whose potency sustained the world. Below him, nobles and priests proving loyalty through ritualized intimacy. And at the bottom, slaves and children, whose suffering was reframed as sacred service. Each level fed the one above, and together they maintained a system where sexuality was not freedom but control, a cosmic chain binding flesh to power. It is tempting to imagine Egypt's grandeur as a tale of stone and gold, of pyramids and papyri. But beneath the monuments lay this darker pyramid of power, built not of limestone but of human bodies, arranged in a hierarchy where intimacy was weaponized as a tool of political and divine domination. Of all those ensnared in Egypt's sacred hierarchy, none bore a fate more tragic than the children dedicated to temple service. For them, life began not with play or learning, but with training that stripped away innocence and replaced it with ritual duty. Families of wealth and power often surrendered their youngest to the priesthood, convinced it was an honor. In truth, it was a sacrifice of flesh and spirit disguised as devotion. From as early as 6 or 7, these children were instructed in practices they could scarcely comprehend. Ancient medical papyri describe exercises designed to increase flexibility, endurance, and control over bodily functions. Some texts, written in the same clinical tone as instructions for treating wounds or brewing remedies, outline techniques for prolonging pleasure, for suppressing natural reactions, for transforming small bodies into instruments of ritual performance. These were not lessons of faith but of control, imposed upon children too young to question, too powerless to resist. The toll was devastating. Medical analysis of skeletal remains from temple complexes shows stunted growth, malnutrition, and evidence of chronic injuries. Hips and spines twisted by forced positions, joints strained beyond natural limits. Infection and internal damage were common, with mortality rates among temple children shockingly high. Archaeologists estimate that nearly 3 out of 4 did not survive past adolescence, their lives extinguished by rituals meant to preserve Egypt's cosmic balance. And yet, their suffering was veiled in religious justification. Priests proclaimed that these children were chosen by the gods, blessed to serve as vessels of divine energy. Families were encouraged to feel pride, not grief, when their sons or daughters were taken. To question the system was to risk sacrilege, to endanger the harmony of man. Thus parents wept in silence while their children disappeared into the shadowed chambers of the temples, returning, if at all, broken in body and spirit. For those who survived into adulthood, the scars were not only physical. Ancient writings hint at survivors who became incapable of forming bonds, trapped in compulsive cycles of behavior, or retreating entirely from human connection. Modern psychologists would recognize their symptoms as trauma, though to the Egyptians they were merely marked by the gods. Their pain was invisible, hidden behind the language of divine service. The economics of the system compounded its cruelty. Children could be bought, sold, and traded specifically for ritual use, their price determined by age and condition. Wealthy patrons funded this market, believing that by supporting temple children they were investing in cosmic stability. In reality, they were underwriting a machine of systematic exploitation that endured for centuries. In the shadows of Egypt's great temples, while hymns echoed and incense rose toward the heavens, the smallest voices were silenced. These children, who should have known laughter and play, instead carried the unbearable burden of sustaining a civilization's faith. They were told their suffering was holy, their bodies were divine property, their lives were not their own. And for most, the price of this devotion was death before they had even lived. If the training of temple children revealed Egypt's hidden cruelty in silence, then the feast of drunkenness exposed it in spectacle. Once each year, the entire civilization seemed to erupt into chaos, cloaked in the name of divine worship. To the Egyptians, this was no mere festival of pleasure. It was a reenactment of myth, a ritual believed to preserve the fragile balance of the cosmos. But to modern eyes, it was a descent into madness. The story began with Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and destruction. According to legend, Ra, the sun god, had grown angry with humanity's disobedience and sent Sekhmet to punish them. She slaughtered so ferociously that the earth ran red with blood. To save mankind, Ra tricked her. He poured thousands of jars of beer dyed with red ochre across the fields. Mistaking it for blood, Sekhmet drank until she collapsed in intoxicated stupor. When she awoke, her rage was gone, and she was transformed into Hathor, the gentler goddess of love, music, and joy. The Egyptians retold this myth each year through the Feast of Drunkenness, believing that by reliving Sekhmet's pacification, they would prevent her wrath from returning. But the ritual took on a life of its own. It was not simply commemoration, it became participation. For 7 days and nights, Egyptians drank themselves into oblivion, convinced that intoxication opened their bodies as vessels for the gods. Preparation for the feast began months in advance. Temples brewed massive quantities of beer, thick, strong, sometimes mixed with psychoactive extracts from blue lotus flowers and other plants known for their hallucinogenic properties. The beer was more than drink. It was a potion designed to loosen minds, dissolve inhibitions, and blur the line between mortal and divine. As the first cups were raised, worshippers believed they were inviting the gods into their flesh. At first, the festival may have resembled celebration. Music, dancing, laughter, the joy of release after the rigid order of daily life. But as intoxication deepened, the boundaries collapsed. Masters and slaves drank side by side. Women abandoned households to join processions through the streets. Children were swept into the chaos, exposed to acts they could not understand. What began as ritual joy turned into frenzy, a collective surrender to impulse where every action, no matter how violent or obscene, was excused as divine possession. Priests not only tolerated but encouraged this madness. To them, the festival was sacred theater, the embodiment of myth. If people tore off their clothes in ecstasy, if they struck one another, if they joined in public acts of intimacy, this was not sin but communion. The chaos was framed as cosmic necessity, a reenactment of Sekhmet's intoxication that kept the goddess pacified and the world safe. Foreign visitors recoiled. Records from Mesopotamian envoys describe shock and horror at the scale of Egyptian excess, labeling the feast barbaric, a stain on what otherwise seemed a grand and ordered civilization. Yet to the Egyptians, it was the highest devotion. To lose oneself entirely, to dissolve into chaos, to become for 1 week a vessel of the divine. The Feast of Drunkenness was both spectacle and sacrament, a mirror of Egypt's paradox, majestic order underpinned by ritual chaos, cosmic balance purchased with human abandon. And as the nights wore on, the line between worship and violence grew thin indeed. As the Feast of Drunkenness reached its peak, Egypt abandoned all pretense of order. The rigid hierarchy that governed every day of the year, pharaoh above nobles, nobles above priests, priests above slaves, collapsed into a frenzy where nothing was forbidden. For 7 days and nights, the land gave itself over to intoxication, lust, and violence, all under the sanction of the gods. Ancient hymns describe the scene as the laughter of Hathor filling the streets, but beneath that poetic phrase lay something far darker. Drunken mobs stormed through villages, dragging unwilling participants into their revelry. Masters publicly took slaves in acts that would shame even the most decadent courts of Rome. Married women abandoned their homes, swept into the current of bodies moving through the night. Children, unprotected, were forced to watch, or worse, to join acts they could never comprehend. The beer, laced with blue lotus and other intoxicants, did more than blur vision. It dissolved identity. Participants reported visions of gods descending into their bodies, divine voices commanding them to act without restraint. In this state, violence and intimacy fused. Men competed to see who could maintain arousal through hours of drunken delirium. Women were seized and displayed as offerings. Biting, scratching, drawing blood, these were considered marks of favor from the goddess herself. The chaos was not limited to desire. Violence surged alongside pleasure. Crowds trampled the weak in narrow streets. Bodies collapsed in exhaustion or death, their broken forms left where they fell until the madness subsided. Some revelers inflicted wounds deliberately, believing pain itself was sacred, a visible sign of divine possession. To the Egyptian mind, what happened in these nights was not horror but holiness. The priests taught that any act committed under the goddess's intoxication was by definition sacred. Abuse became ritual, violence became offering, madness became communion. Archaeological evidence confirms these accounts. Excavations of temple sites reveal chambers with stone benches stained in ways consistent with repeated use for ritualized sexual activity. Carvings show images of drunken processions, men and women locked in frenzied embraces beneath the eyes of Hathor's priests. Some frescoes, when first uncovered by 19th century explorers, were so explicit they were plastered over immediately, never shown to the public. The consequences of the feast lingered long after the music died. Families woke to find themselves torn apart by what had happened during the nights of frenzy. Husbands discovered wives pregnant by strangers. Children born 9 months later bore the stigma of being children of Hathor, products of divine possession rather than family lineage. Shame lingered, yet priests reassured the people. Such births were not curses but blessings, proof that the gods had mingled with mortals. Foreign observers were horrified. Mesopotamian diplomats wrote of the Egyptians as a people who drink blood in the name of joy, who make beasts of their children and call it worship. Some kingdoms refused to send envoys to Egypt during the festival months, fearing not only for their dignity but for their safety. Yet within Egypt itself, the feast continued year after year for centuries. What we see as chaos, the Egyptians believed was salvation. By surrendering to madness, they reenacted the myth of Sekhmet, ensuring she remained pacified, ensuring that Ra's wrath never again turned upon the earth. For them, disorder was not sin. It was the price of cosmic balance. In those nights of frenzy, the Egyptians revealed their deepest paradox. A civilization capable of building monuments to eternity, yet convinced that the survival of the universe itself depended on 7 nights of sanctioned chaos. When the final jars of beer were drained and the fires burned low, the feast of drunkenness left Egypt in eerie silence. Streets littered with broken vessels, exhausted bodies sprawled where they had collapsed, temples heavy with the smell of stale incense and sweat. These were the marks of a civilization that had surrendered itself completely for 7 nights. Yet as dawn broke on the 8th day, priests emerged to declare the gods appeased, the world safe once more, and life was expected to return to its rigid order. But the consequences were far from temporary. The festival fractured families and scarred communities. Husbands awoke beside strangers, unable to remember their own actions. Wives returned home carrying pregnancies they could not explain. Children born months later bore the cruel label of children of Hathor, their very existence a reminder of nights their parents longed to forget. These children often grew up as outcasts, symbols of divine chaos in a society obsessed with order. The psychological aftermath was equally brutal. Participants described memory gaps, waking to discover bruises, scratches, even broken bones they could not recall receiving. Some lived in shame, haunted by flashes of what they had done or what had been done to them. Others embraced denial, clinging to the priest's reassurance that any act during the festival was holy, no matter how violent or degrading. Trauma was sanctified, grief transformed into obedience. The economic cost was staggering. For a full week, agricultural work halted, markets closed, and administrative duties were abandoned. Entire cities stood still while their people indulged in sacred chaos. Crops went untended, trade routes fell silent, and the state treasury absorbed the expense of brewing tens of thousands of jars of beer for mass intoxication. By modern measures, it was an economic disaster, but the pharaohs considered it a necessary one. The feast, costly as it was, served a function no army or granary could. It released the tension of a society bound in rigid hierarchy. For the commoner, it was the only time of year when the order of Egypt inverted. Slaves could mock masters, women could defy husbands, children could behave with impunity. For 1 week, the system of power that ruled every waking moment was dissolved in chaos. And when the feast ended, when the Nile's waters rose and order returned, the people accepted once more the yoke of hierarchy. The festival was, in effect, a pressure valve, a ritualized rebellion allowed only under the watchful eye of priests. Archaeological evidence reveals how deliberately this was engineered. At sites like Dendera and Karnak, excavations have uncovered chambers built for group activities, rooms with benches and drains, their design unmistakable. These were not accidental spaces of chaos. They were engineered environments for ritual excess. Even the preparation of the beer was controlled by temple authorities, who mixed psychoactive plants into the brew to heighten visions and frenzy. Foreigners were appalled, but within Egypt the logic held. Chaos prevented greater destruction. Just as Sekhmet had been subdued by intoxication, so too could society pacify its own violent energies by unleashing them in controlled bursts. To deny the festival, priests warned, was to risk famine, flood, or divine wrath. Thus the feast of drunkenness became both terror and necessity, trauma and tradition. It destroyed lives but preserved a civilization, leaving scars on the bodies of its people while convincing them that those scars were holy. And as centuries passed, the paradox deepened. A society that built monuments of perfect order sustained itself each year through ritualized collapse into madness. The feast of drunkenness, with its sanctioned chaos, endured for centuries. But no tradition, however deeply rooted, could withstand the collision of civilizations. When Alexander the Great's armies swept into Egypt in 332 BCE, the land of the pharaohs entered a new era. Greek rulers of the Ptolemaic dynasty inherited a kingdom of gods and rituals they barely understood. And one of their greatest challenges was reconciling Egyptian sexual mysticism with their own Hellenistic ideals. For the Greeks, intimacy was not devoid of ritual, but it was never elevated to the level of cosmic necessity. They viewed the Egyptian system with unease. The Ptolemies were compelled to adopt native traditions to maintain legitimacy. Yet the extremes of Egyptian worship shocked their sensibilities. Imagine a Greek king raised on the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, suddenly required to participate in drunken festivals where nobles and commoners alike descended into frenzied acts. To refuse would risk rebellion. To comply meant horror and shame. Cleopatra, I attempted reform. Sources suggest she tried to shorten the festival's duration and limit its public excesses, presenting it in a way that seemed more palatable to Greek and foreign observers. But priests resisted fiercely. They claimed that reducing the chaos angered the gods. When disasters struck, floods that failed, plagues that spread, whispers arose that these were punishments for tampering with sacred tradition. The Egyptians had long lived by the paradox that order could only be preserved through ritualized disorder. To meddle with that balance was to invite catastrophe. By the time of Cleopatra Roman III, the tension had become unbearable. Rome, now rising as a Mediterranean superpower, viewed Egyptian practices with outright disgust. Roman envoys described the feasts as proof that Egypt is ruled by madness, and moralists held them up as examples of decadence leading to decline. Yet Egyptian priests threatened revolt if the festivals were abolished outright. Cleopatra's solution was compromise. Private, scaled-down versions of the feast conducted behind temple walls for Egyptian elites, while a more restrained, almost theatrical version was presented to Roman audiences. This double life, chaos hidden behind closed doors, order displayed for foreign eyes, created a culture of hypocrisy. Publicly, Egypt sought to appear civilized in Roman terms. Privately, it clung to rituals that had defined its faith for millennia. The result was instability. Nobles whispered that the gods were displeased with foreign rule. Romans whispered that Egyptian rulers were corrupt and depraved. In this climate of fear and compromise, the abuse of children and slaves did not diminish, it grew. With Roman scrutiny forcing secrecy, ceremonies moved into hidden chambers, away from public squares but no less violent. Children were trafficked in greater numbers, hidden behind temple walls that outsiders were forbidden to enter. What had once been performed openly in the streets under the guise of divine possession was now driven underground, intensified by secrecy and desperation. The clash between Greek rationalism and Egyptian mysticism fractured the very core of society. A people who for centuries had seen intimacy as divine now found their worldview condemned as barbaric by foreign powers. They were told to abandon what their ancestors had deemed sacred, yet to obey meant betraying the gods who had sustained them. The result was cultural trauma on a scale as vast as the pyramids themselves. This was the beginning of the end. As Rome tightened its grip, the feasts became battlegrounds not only between gods and men, but between civilizations. And soon, the most powerful empire the world had ever seen would bring the hammer down on Egypt's sacred chaos once and for all. When Rome finally seized Egypt in 30 BCE, the age of pharaohs collapsed under the weight of an empire that tolerated no rival gods. Augustus Caesar, inheriting the treasures of the Nile, also inherited its darkest secrets. Roman commanders, entering the temples of Luxor, Karnak, and Dendera, were appalled by what they saw. Chambers still marked by rituals of intoxication, frescoes depicting acts no Roman citizen would name aloud, and priests who insisted that without such ceremonies, the world itself would unravel. To Augustus, this was not religion but barbarity masquerading as faith. The Roman response was swift and merciless. Temples were stripped of explicit carvings, their walls hammered smooth or plastered over. Ritual objects were destroyed, scrolls describing sexual ceremonies consigned to fire. Priests who resisted were executed, Their blood spilled in the same courtyards where they once claimed to channel divine fertility. The empire that prided itself on law and order imposed its own morality upon Egypt, erasing centuries of sacred chaos in a single generation. Yet even in suppression, trauma lingered. Children who had been raised in temple service, conditioned from their earliest days to see their bodies as offerings, found themselves cast adrift. Many could not adapt. Roman records, clinical and unsympathetic, describe former temple children wandering in despair, some taking their own lives when their only sense of worth was stripped away. Others formed underground circles, desperate to recreate fragments of the rituals that had defined their existence. Roman governors reported secret cults continuing ceremonies in hidden rooms, carrying on the traditions under threat of death. The psychological scars ran deep. Generations had been taught that intimacy was cosmic obligation, that pain could be sacred, that violation was service to the gods. To have that entire framework torn away left a vacuum. Cultural memory does not vanish overnight. Patterns of belief persisted, half hidden in folk practices, whispered in rural villages long after the official temples had fallen silent. Rome believed it had civilized Egypt by erasing its excesses, but in truth, it created a society fractured by loss, a people stripped not only of their kings but of the very rituals that had explained their existence. To the conquerors, this was victory. To the conquered, it was dismemberment of the soul. The monuments of Egypt still stood, pyramids, obelisks, statues towering against the desert sky, but their meaning had been hollowed out. Where once they were alive with rituals that terrified and fascinated, they now stood as mute relics of a faith deemed unworthy. The cosmic energy the Egyptians once believed sustained the Nile was reduced to myth, their sacred chaos branded as shame. And yet, fragments endured, scraps of papyri buried in sand, murals overlooked by Roman destroyers, whispers passed down across centuries. Enough remained to reveal that Egypt had once been more than stone and gold, that behind its majesty had lain rituals so disturbing that even the world's greatest empire sought to erase them from history.